En segundo lugar, le vamos a dar la participación a Philip Owen con el tema Forestando en la pradera, la experiencia de Sudáfrica. Philip es fundador de la organización sudafricana Geasphere, con una vasta experiencia en investigación sobre los impactos de la forestación en la pradera y en el agua. Adelante, Philip.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here tonight and to speak to you a little bit about our experiences in South Africa. I'd like to especially thank the WRM, the World Rainforest Movement, for this opportunity. And thinking back, 1999, 2000, I had another opportunity from the World Rainforest Movement as they invited me to write an article for the bulletin, which I did. And I thought a bit about the article that I wrote today, and it was basically comparing two mountains which I can see from my home. The one mountain is natural and the other mountain is planted to timber plantations. And I thought about the way that the one mountain, which is natural, is full of life. There's leopards, there's pythons, there's jackal, there's hare, there's many different kinds of insects. And I assigned to each of those animals and plants a light value. And I would think that a leopard would, for instance, shine brightly, and a snake would glimmer as it crawls along the soil. And in my mind's eye, the one mountain was shimmering with light, full of different light moving around and full of life. Whereas the other mountain was just this feeble glow of monoculture. We have in South Africa approximately 1.5 million hectares of industrial timber plantations. We cannot call them forests. It's not a forestry industry. It's an industrial timber plantation. 1.5 million hectares. Mostly composed of eucalyptus and pine tree species and some wattle. In addition to this 1.5 million hectares of managed timber plantations, there's an additional 1.6 million hectares of invader plantations. Because as you know, eucalyptus trees and pine trees are invasive species, very much invasive in our region. So there's actually more plantations that's invaded the natural grassland areas than what there are managed plantations. So in totality, there's an estimated or an approximately 3 million hectares of industrial timber plantations in our country. There's several impacts, and I'd like to talk about the impacts on water. I would like to talk about the impacts on biodiversity, and then I would like to talk about the impacts on the social structure and the social dynamics of our country. Not far from where I live, there's a plantation called Monocultivos, and where there was some extensive research performed. They established a eucalyptus plantation. 4 years after the plantation was established, the surface water dried up. So all the streams and the fountains in that area dried up. When the plantation was eventually harvested at 15 years of age, it took 5 years before the streams started flowing again. And it shows that the eucalyptus trees physically draws down the water level, the groundwater level. There's been extensive research on the water use of timber plantations in our region, and we know that some eucalyptus roots have been measured at 50 meters plus, capable of penetrating 50 meters plus into the soil profile, of course extracting groundwater. These trees are evergreen. And when I say this, every time I think of Ricardo Carrere, where he said that these trees are selfish trees. In our region, it's a summer rainfall area. So we have rainfall in the summertime. But the evergreen tree species utilize water throughout the summer, the winter, they utilize water. Because they've got their roots deep into the soil profile. The indigenous trees would drop their leaves, where you can see the skeleton of the tree, And it indicates that it's not using water. It's a clever tree. It knows that it's dry, and that the little bit of water resource that there is needs to leave a little bit for the other components of the ecosystem. But the eucalyptus and the pine trees, they don't feel the same way. They are selfish. They utilize water throughout the year, be it in winter time, be it in summertime. They use the water. The result is that, especially in the winter time, there's a huge impact on the low flow of the rivers. Many of the streams and the fountains, the springs, dry up completely in the winter time. And of course, that leads to huge impacts to communities who are dependent on the water from the rivers for sustaining their livelihoods. So timber plantations have a massive impact on the water resource of our region. We calculated that to produce a single ton of pulp, because most of these plantations are for the production of pulp, for paper. To produce 1 ton of pulp, you need an estimated 2 million liters of water, if you consider the growth of the trees during the 12 to 15 years that they would be utilizing water. So 2 million liters of water can fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool, whereas a ton of pulp can fit onto the back of a small 1-ton bakkie or pickup truck. So certainly that doesn't make sense. How can we utilize that much of that scarce and precious resource, water? Southern Africa is not the region that's rich in water. We've got an average rainfall of about 430 millimeters. So it's not a lot. And we should not be sacrificing our water to produce pulp for export purposes. You can quantify it further, and in a single sheet of A4 sized paper, there's an estimated 10 liters of water. 10 liters of water in a single sheet, A4 sheet of paper. So it's a lot of water. And therefore paper is too cheap. Paper should be much, much, much more expensive so that people can assign higher value to the paper. About biodiversity, most of the plantations in our region is planted in the grassland biome. The grassland in our region is incredibly biodiverse, with an estimated 4,000 plant species to be found in the grassland. Remember that the plants create habitat for other components of the ecosystem. So grassland is incredibly biodiverse. If you think in terms of the plants, the insects they sustain, the microorganisms, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, incredibly biodiverse. The grassland plants are adapted to sunlight. They need sunlight. So for sure, when you establish your timber plantation, of course you exclude sunlight. Eventually the canopy will close. Not enough light penetrates to sustain the indigenous plants in the understory. So those plants die. Also, of course, grassland is adapted to fire. It needs to burn. It needs to burn once every 4, maybe every 10 years. But it needs to burn. If it doesn't burn, there's some plants in the grassland that simply won't germinate. So when you remove fire from the management of the grassland, you destroy the grassland. And of course, that is what's happening. Timber plantations, of course, timber plantation management, they exclude fire completely from management of the plantations. They don't like fire. And of course, nowadays, we have completely changed the burning regime in our region with devastating impacts on the natural grasslands. Even where grasslands are not planted to timber plantations, they are slowly changing to forests. Because in the old days, before there was this clamp down on fire, the fires would burn more or less this time of the year. Late in the winter, early spring, just before the first spring rains, when there's a very high likelihood of lightning-induced fires. The fires would then burn very, very hot in the very dry grassland, and that would kill any of the tree seedlings that might potentially be coming up and the grassland would be killed by the hot burning fire. So nowadays we don't burn at the right time of the year anymore. We're not allowed to burn at the right time of the year. In fact, by end of June, we are not allowed to burn anymore. So all fire breaks, all block burns needs to take place, needs to occur before the end of June. So during that time, the grass is still not completely dry. It doesn't burn as hot as it should, and many of the tree seedlings survive. So you find that the grassland biome slowly but surely changing into a forest biome. And the grassland biome is much, much, much more biodiverse than a forest biome. So you find that there's an incredible impoverishment taking place. Grassland have many vital natural services, such as water retention. It's like a sponge. When it rains, it holds the water back and allows it the time slowly to seep into the underground aquifers. When you destroy the grassland, you destroy those services. Just opposite to where I stay, there's a massive mountain planted to timber, and just recently all those trees were harvested. It's after the second rotation on that particular mountain. Now when you go there, you see the slopes are bare. There's no soil, there's no plants, and when the rain eventually comes in the early summer months, there's nothing to hold back the soil. And we find incredible soil erosion in our region, where the rivers literally run red like blood from soil, which is not, of course, a good thing to export. So, impacts on biodiversity, impacts on water, and then impacts on the social dynamics of our country. In our region, there used to be very much diversified agriculture. There used to be dairy farmers, sheep farmers, vegetable farmers, fruit farmers. And as the timber plantations started growing, started in the late 1800s when the first timber was planted for the production of timber for the mining industry. But then from the 1960s and especially through the 70s and the 80s, there were massive expansions for production of pulp. Massive, massive, massive expansions. And now we sit with rivers running red, white blood, soil going down to Maputo, to Mozambique, and we sit with much less opportunities for local people. Because in that diversity of the farming agriculture that there was, the different agriculture models, there was a lot of choice for people. They could choose, they could become cattle farmers, they could become sheep farmers, or they could make cheese, or they could farm with vegetables or fruit trees. And now those diversified farming systems have been consolidated in these massive timber plantation estates, where there's actually very few job opportunities that can be created. Of course, you need you need some labor to plant the trees. But after the trees have been planted, it's many years before management intervention is required. A little bit of pruning, but after, maybe on most of the trees for the production of pulp is on a 9 to 15 year rotation cycle. So it's a long period of time where you actually need no people inside the timber plantation. So there's very few job opportunities created. And the job opportunities that there are in the timber plantations, it's not quality jobs. We find chainsaw operators. After a couple of years, they physically develop a nerve sickness, where physically they would shake involuntarily because of the damage that's been done to their nervous systems by operating these chainsaws. Bark strippers in field, and mostly women are being used. And the people, the payments that people receive, the salaries, the minimum salaries is very, very, very low. You find people working nowadays, and that's still a relatively good salary, for approximately $200 or $250 a month, US dollars. Whereas the Chief Executive Officer of SAPI, which is South African Paper and Pulp Industry, multinational corporation, most of their shareholders in the UK. But that CEO, he receives more than $80,000 a month. So the highest paid person in the timber plantation industry, yes, $80,000 a month, making good money. But the people that he employs receives less than $200 a month. So surely that can not be termed fair. I think especially of our colleagues in Swaziland and the people in Swaziland. 10% of Swaziland, our neighboring country, completely surrounded by South Africa and a little bit Mozambique. 10% of Swaziland have been transformed to industrial timber plantations. And the people of Swaziland are not, they're cattle farmers, and they're pastoralists, they're small-scale farmers. And now they're struggling to earn a living, because there's no more grazing for the cattle in many of those regions. There's no more water for small-scale farming. So many people are moving to the cities, where they have to struggle to try and make ends meet. So from a social perspective, timber plantations have not been good for our country. Even from a safety perspective, in the grasslands, they're open and well, you can see forever. But if you plant your timber plantations, there's lots of place for the thieves to hide. It's become a dangerous place. It's dangerous to move through timber plantations. It's dark. It's not a nice place to be. So timber plantations in our country has had a very, very negative impact on water, on biodiversity, and the social dynamics of our country. I always feel that I'm so negative when talking about timber plantations. It's not nice to talk about timber plantations because it's all these negative impacts. Lots of costs associated to timber plantations. We have a big pulp mill not far from where I live, about 30 kilometers from where I live. Sometimes you can smell the stink 80 kilometers away. You can smell that pulp mill. The people that live close to the workers close to that pulp mill, they get lots of lung diseases. They have to go to the doctor at their own cost and at their own expense. Really, those doctor's bills should be paid by the timber industry. Small-scale farmers who live underneath catchments that's planted to timber, they find that their streams have dried up. Now they can't farm anymore because they've got no water. But that is surely a cost that should go to the timber industry, because it's not the small-scale farmer who caused the streams to dry up. It is the timber industry that caused those streams to dry up. So surely one should quantify and you should say, okay, that farmer maybe you could make 2,000 rand a month by selling the maize that he produces. So take that 2,000 rand bill and give it to the timber industry. Let them pay it. And see how lucrative the timber industry is if you internalize all the costs. But they externalize their costs. They don't pay for the water that they've dried up. They don't pay for the people who they maim or who they harm by inducing these lung sicknesses. So it's important that the industry should internalize their costs so that one could actually see if they're profitable or not. We're looking at how we should go forward in our country. And the first thing that we are adamant about is that there should be no more expansion of this destructive model. There should be no more expansion. In our country, there's especially in my province of Mpumalanga, the government has recognized the fact that timber plantations utilize a lot of water. And it is not easy to get a license to plant timber in our region. Timber plantations have been classified as stream flow reduction activities. And you have to get a license to plant timber plantation. And like I say, in our region, no more water available, so almost impossible to get a license to plant timber. So of course, South African paper and pulp industry, Kumatiland Forests, who's the state-owned plantation company, they're all looking towards our neighbor Mozambique for establishing timber plantations, because there's still a lot of land available in that region. So in Mozambique, it's really problematic, and we try to advocate, we try to raise awareness that timber plantations come with a huge cost. We should look at our consumption of paper. Is it necessary to use that much paper? We should reduce the use. We should reuse, and we should recycle. And then we should also see, and we should also recognize that on the long term, monoculture is not good for the environment. It impoverishes the soil, and 50, 60, 100 years from now, there will be no more life force in the soil. So we have to start thinking now how to change that. And we have to start thinking about introducing diversity into these plantation systems. That we don't grow a single kind of tree, but that we grow multiple trees, multiple kinds of trees, for multiple services and multiple benefits. And that we look at working with nature, not working against nature all the time, because in the long term, that will impact very negatively on us. It seems as if people have forgotten that we're part of this natural system, that we rely upon the water and the oxygen and the soil that nature gives us. It seems as if we've forgotten that. We must remember that, and we must work towards a sustainable model of plantation forestry. Indigenous trees, trees that's used to growing in our country, that's what we should plant. Of course, they don't plant them because they grow too slow. But of course, in the long term, it's a good idea. Slower growing, higher value product over the long term. So, first of all, stop the expansion. Secondly, looking at different models that is more environmentally sensitive and socially acceptable in our region. Gracias.